In March Music 1862, an impossibility unfolded in Yazoo County, Mississippi. Music, a slave named Elijah, had been interred 3 days earlier, having succumbed to a brutal whipping. His owner, Colonel Harrison Blackwood, showed up at the funeral to confirm the body was properly buried. Blackwood even covered the cost of the coffin, an uncommon move that some interpreted as remorse, others as merely safeguarding the final disposal of his asset. Yet on the third night after the burial, Elijah walked out of Riverside Cemetery, passed through the gates of Blackwood Manor, and launched a vengeance spree that would claim 13 lives, uncover a fortune founded on murder, and ignite a series of slave uprisings that Confederate officials frantically tried to suppress. What truly happened inside that grave? How could a dead man return? And what terrible secret was worth killing to protect? Before we reveal the astonishing truth, drop a comment letting me know which state you're from. Now, let me transport you back to the beginning. The Mississippi Delta in 1862 was a region devoured by war and dread. The Civil War had been raging for over a year. Fort Sumter had fallen in April 1861. The Confederacy had scored early triumphs at Bull Run and Wilson's Creek, victories that made Southern plantation owners believe their rebellion would wrap up quickly. But by early 1862, the tide was shifting. Union forces were pushing into Confederate territory from multiple sides. General Ulysses S. Grant had seized Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. New Orleans was on the verge of falling to Admiral Farragut's fleet, and the Great Siege of Vicksburg, which would eventually choke the Confederacy, was drawing near. In places like Yazoo County, deep in cotton country, plantation owners were growing anxious not only about military defeat, but about what defeat would mean for their entire way of life. Their wealth was built on slavery, their social standing came from owning slaves, their political power rested on upholding the institution. If the Confederacy lost, if slavery was abolished, they would lose everything, not just money, but identity. Not just property, but the very bedrock of their existence. That fear turned them dangerous, made them willing to do things they might never have considered in peacetime, made them brutal in ways that shocked even a society accustomed to slavery's casual violence. Colonel Harrison Blackwood embodied this desperation perfectly. At 47, he'd been born into plantation aristocracy. His father had owned Blackwood Manor before him. His grandfather had carved the original plantation from the wilderness in 1798. 3 generations of Blackwoods had amassed their fortune on enslaved backs, and Harrison had no intention of being the generation that lost it all. He'd led a Confederate regiment in the war's early months, fought at First Bull Run, then returned home in late 1861, claiming chronic dysentery, but really out of sheer terror. He'd seen Union artillery, modern warfare, the North's industrial might. And, unlike his fellow planters who guzzled their own propaganda about Southern superiority, Blackwood understood they would probably lose. Blackwood Manor sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Delta farmland. Before the war, it had been valued at over $400 tens of millions today. The main house was a Greek Revival masterpiece, white columns gleaming, surrounded by magnolias and manicured gardens. Behind that beautiful facade, however, lay an empire of suffering. 230 slaves worked the cotton fields, worked 18-hour days during harvest, worked in heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees, worked under overseers who believed whipping was the only language slaves understood, worked in conditions that killed roughly 10% of the workforce. Every year losses, Blackwood simply replaced by buying new slaves or forcing breeding among the existing population. Elijah had been born on Blackwood Manor in 1843, the son of a woman named Grace, brought from Virginia as a teenager, and a father whose identity was unknown, possibly one of the overseers, possibly Blackwood's own father. Elijah's light skin suggested mixed ancestry, which brought both advantages and dangers in the slave hierarchy. He was selected as a house slave at age 7, trained to serve in the main house, to be invisible and useful at the same time. This position gave him access to information field slaves never got. He learned to read by watching Blackwood's children with their tutors, memorizing letters and words, practicing in secret despite harsh penalties for slave literacy. By age 15, Elijah could read newspapers, grasp political discussions, and understand the wider world beyond Yazoo County. That education made Elijah dangerous to Blackwood, though the colonel didn't realize it. Dangerous because Elijah understood that slavery wasn't natural or inevitable. Understood it was a political and economic system upheld by violence and law. Understood it could be challenged, resisted, potentially overthrown. Elijah watched the world change around him. The abolitionist movement growing in the North, sectional tensions escalating, Mississippi and other southern states seceding after Lincoln's election. And he waited for the moment when the system might crack enough to let him strike. That opportunity began to take shape in February 1862, though Elijah didn't see it right away. Blackwood received late night visitors, 3 Confederate officers in dusty uniforms. They arrived in a closed carriage, didn't want to be seen, spoke in hushed tones in Blackwood's study. Elijah served brandy and maintained the fiction of invisibility that house slaves perfected. He caught fragments of conversation, words like gold and security and absolute discretion. He heard one officer say, "Richmond trusts you, Colonel. This is the Confederacy's future we're entrusting to your care." He heard Blackwood reply with assurances about his loyalty and the safety of his property. After the officers left, Elijah noticed Blackwood's behavior change. The colonel became nervous, excited, fearful all at once. He spent hours writing letters he immediately burned. He rode to remote sections of the plantation places with no fields or structures, serving no apparent agricultural purpose. He had intense whispered conversations with his chief overseer, Cyrus Webb conversations that stopped abruptly whenever anyone approached. Something significant was happening, something secret, something that made Blackwood both greedy and terrified. The gold arrived on the night of February 28, 1862. Elijah was awakened at 2:00 a.m. by unusual sounds. Wagons rolling through the plantation in darkness, men shouting in low voices, unusual activity at a time when the plantation should have been silent. He crept to a window and saw something extraordinary, a military convoy, 6 wagons, each drawn by 4 horses. Confederate soldiers surrounding the wagons, at least 30 men, all heavily armed. And supervising it all was a young officer, a captain, whose nameplate read Brennan. The wagons pulled up to Blackwood's largest barn, usually used for storing cotton during harvest, but currently empty because the 1861 harvest had already been shipped. Soldiers began unloading crates from the wagons, heavy wooden crates that required 2 men to carry, crates that made metallic sounds when they shifted. 20 crates total, each marked with Confederate Army stamps. The unloading took 2 hours. When finished, the barn was locked with 3 separate padlocks. Guards were posted, and Captain Brennan retired to the plantation house as Blackwood's guest. Over the next 3 days, Elijah pieced together what had happened. The crates contained gold, Confederate gold, approximately $2 million worth. This wasn't just any gold. This was part of the Confederate Treasury's reserve, the emergency fund meant to keep the rebellion alive if everything else failed. Gold that could buy supplies, pay soldiers, purchase recognition from European powers. It had been moved from Richmond to Jackson as Union forces threatened the Confederate capital. Now it was being dispersed to multiple hiding places throughout the Deep South, places where, even if Richmond fell and the Confederate government collapsed, this gold could fund guerrilla resistance and finance the continuation of the war by other means. Blackwood Manor had been chosen as one hiding spot because of its isolation, its tightly controlled loyal slave population, and Blackwood's reputation as a hardline Confederate. Captain Wesley Brennan commanded the 6, soldier escort assigned to guard the gold. They were to remain at the plantation until receiving further orders from Richmond. Could be weeks, could be months, depending on the war's progress. They settled into a routine, slept in the barn with the gold, took meals at the main house, patrolled the grounds. They were young men, most barely 20, excited by their important mission, but also bored by guard duty's tedium. Elijah watched all this with growing realization. $2 million hidden on the plantation, guarded by only 6 soldiers. If that gold could be seized and taken from Confederate control, it could change everything, could fund slave escapes, buy freedom for hundreds of families, support the Union war effort. But how could one slave, or even all 230 slaves on the plantation, overcome armed guards? How could they move 20 crates of gold without being caught? How could they turn Confederate gold into practical freedom? These questions became moot on the night of March 3, 1862. That was the night Harrison Blackwood decided that $2 million in gold sitting on his property was too tempting to resist. That was the night he chose personal wealth over Confederate loyalty. That was the night he became a murderer on a scale that shocked even Elijah, who thought he'd seen every cruelty slavery could produce. It started innocently. Blackwood invited Captain Brennan and his 6 soldiers to dinner at the main house, a proper dinner, the kind planters hosted to show off their wealth and sophistication. Multiple courses, fine wines, expensive bourbon afterward. The soldiers, tired from weeks of travel and bored from guard duty, accepted eagerly. They washed, put on clean uniforms, came to the dining room with appetites and good spirits. They had no reason to suspect anything. Blackwood had been a gracious host, had provided everything they needed, had seemed the model of Confederate hospitality and cooperation. The dinner progressed through multiple courses: oyster soup, roasted duck, sweet potatoes, fresh bread, bacon pie. The soldiers ate and drank. Their initial formality gave way to relaxation. They told stories about the war, battles they'd witnessed, friends who'd died, hopes for Confederate victory. Blackwood encouraged them, refilled their glasses, played the sympathetic host. The soldiers didn't notice that their bourbon came from a special decanter, didn't notice the slightly bitter aftertaste, didn't realize until too late that they were drinking poison. The first soldier to react was a private named James Dockery, only 19, from a small farm in Alabama. He'd been in the middle of a story about his younger brother when his voice suddenly cut off. His hand went to his throat. His eyes widened in confusion and terror. He tried to stand, knocked over his chair, stumbled. The other soldiers looked at him in confusion. Then another soldier convulsed, then another. Within 60 seconds, all 7 men were in distress, clawing at their throats, gasping for air, collapsing, dying. Elijah watched from his position by the door, frozen in horror. He'd seen violence before: slaves beaten to death, children sold away from mothers, every casual cruelty of slavery. But this was different. This was calculated mass murder. This was Blackwood killing 7 men who trusted him, who'd eaten his food and drunk his liquor, who believed he was their ally. The soldiers writhed on the floor, some vomited blood, some had seizures. One young soldier, couldn't have been more than 17, reached toward Blackwood with a pleading expression, seeking help, seeking explanation. Blackwood stood over him, watched him die, showed no emotion whatsoever. When the last soldier stopped moving, Blackwood turned to Cyrus Webb, who'd been standing guard at the door. "Get Thomas, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, and James. Tell them to bring shovels and chains. We have bodies to dispose of." Webb nodded and left. Blackwood then looked directly at Elijah. "You saw nothing. You were never in this room tonight. If you speak one word of this to anyone, I'll have you flayed alive and your body fed to the hogs. Do you understand?" Elijah, terrified, nodded. "Yes, Master, I understand." Over the next 6 hours, Elijah was forced to help move the bodies. 6 men arrived: Thomas Riddle, Marcus Finch, Samuel Cross, Daniel Marsh, James Cutter, and Peter Stillwell. These were Blackwood's most trusted overseers and guardsmen who'd proven their loyalty through years of brutalizing slaves, men who wouldn't balk at murder if the price was right. And Blackwood was paying them well. Each man would receive $5,000 from the gold once it was safely hidden, enough to buy their own small plantations, enough to ensure their silence. The bodies were dragged through the plantation under cover of darkness, loaded into a wagon, and driven deep into the swamp. The Yazoo swamps were vast, treacherous, filled with quicksand and alligators, a perfect place to hide evidence. They found a spot where the water was deep and dark, where the bottom dropped away to unknown depths. Chains were wrapped around the bodies, heavy chains that would keep them submerged. One by one, the 7 Confederate soldiers were rolled into the water. They sank immediately, disappearing into the black depths. Alligator eyes gleamed in lantern light. Nature would complete the disposal, but Blackwood kept 3 bodies back, Captain Brennan and 2 privates. These bodies were taken to a different location, an old hunting cabin on the far edge of Blackwood's property. The cabin looked abandoned, roof half collapsed, walls rotting. But underneath was a cellar that few people knew existed, a cellar dug during Blackwood's grandfather's time, supposedly for storing ice, but deep and dry and hidden. The 3 bodies went into that cellar, Blackwood's insurance policy. If Confederate authorities came asking questions, he could produce these bodies, claim the soldiers had deserted with the gold, and point to their corpses as proof they'd fought over the spoils and killed each other. The bodies were arranged carefully, made to look like they died in a fight, guns placed in their stiffened hands. The scenes staged perfectly. The gold was moved next. All 20 crates were hauled from the barn to the hidden cellar, back-breaking work. The crates weighed over 100 pounds each, taking 4 men to carry one. They worked through the night. By dawn, the gold was hidden, the cabin was recamouflaged, and all evidence of activity was erased. The 6 men who'd helped were paid their shares $5,000 each. They took the money and scattered, going to different parts of Mississippi, told never to speak of this, never to contact each other, never to give anyone reason to ask questions. Elijah wasn't paid. Elijah was threatened. Blackwood called him to the study the next morning and showed him a whip with metal barbs. "You're smart, Elijah, smarter than most slurs. That makes you useful but also dangerous. So I'm going to be clear. You know what happened. You know where the gold is. You know about the soldiers. If you ever speak of this, I'll make you wish you'd never been born. I'll hurt you in ways you can't imagine. Then I'll kill everyone you care about. Your mother, Grace, your sister, Ruth, every person you've ever spoken to. Do we understand each other?" Elijah, keeping his eyes down, submitted, "Yes, Master, we understand each other." But Elijah was already planning, already calculating, already preparing for the long game. He couldn't act immediately or challenge Blackwood directly. But he could gather evidence, document everything, and prepare for the moment when Blackwood's control weakened, when the war turned, when opportunity emerged. And Elijah had faith that opportunity would come because he understood something Blackwood didn't. The Confederacy was going to lose. Union forces were stronger, better supplied, more numerous. It was only a matter of time. And when the Union came, when Federal forces occupied Mississippi, that would be Elijah's chance. Over the following days, Blackwood created his cover story. He wrote letters to Confederate authorities claiming Captain Brennan and his men had arrived safely, guarded the gold for one night, then departed before dawn, saying they'd received new orders. He expressed confusion about why they'd left so suddenly without proper documentation. He suggested they might have been fake soldiers, imposters who'd stolen real uniforms, and implied the gold had never actually arrived. The lies were smooth, convincing, and with the chaos of war, disrupted communication lines, and overwhelmed bureaucracy, Confederate authorities accepted Blackwood's story. They launched an investigation for the missing soldiers and gold, but it went nowhere. The soldiers were listed as deserters, the gold written off as lost. But Blackwood had a problem. 6 men knew the truth, the 6 overseers who'd helped move bodies and hide gold. They'd been paid well and threatened severely, but they were still liabilities, still potential witnesses if anyone ever investigated seriously. Blackwood needed permanent solutions, needed those 6 men silenced forever. Over the next 2 weeks, they began dying in accidents. Thomas Riddle was crushed when a barn beam fell. Marcus Finch drowned while crossing the river despite being an excellent swimmer. Samuel Cross was trampled by horses that somehow got spooked in their pen. Daniel Marsh died in a barn fire. James Cutter was thrown from a wagon and broke his neck. By mid-March, only 2 of the 6 remained alive, Peter Stillwell and a plantation guard named Josiah Grant. Both men realized what was happening, that Blackwood was eliminating witnesses. They confronted him together, both armed, demanding safe passage off the plantation, or they'd go to authorities with the truth. Blackwood seemed to agree. He promised them safe passage and additional money, asking them to come to the plantation office that evening to collect their payment and receive travel papers. They came, still armed, still suspicious, but Blackwood had prepared an ambush, 4 guards with rifles waiting. Stillwell and Grant were shot before they could react. Their bodies were dumped in the swamp with the others. Elijah witnessed all of this, saw the systematic elimination of witnesses, understood that he was next, that Blackwood would eventually decide even one slave who knew the truth was too dangerous to keep alive. Elijah needed help, allies, someone who could protect him and help execute a plan. He went to Solomon, an old slave on a neighboring plantation called Rosewood. Solomon was nearly 70, had been born in Africa, brought to America on a slave ship in his youth, and had retained knowledge of African medicine and spiritual practices, things the white masters didn't understand and feared. Elijah told Solomon everything: the gold, the murders, Blackwood's systematic elimination of witnesses, and the certainty that Elijah would soon be killed. Solomon listened carefully, asked questions, thought deeply, and finally spoke. "There's a way to survive. It's dangerous, might not work, but it's your only chance." He explained his plan: a drug derived from roots found deep in the swamp, a mixture that would slow Elijah's heart to nearly nothing, slow his breathing until it was imperceptible, and create appearance of death so convincing that even doctors would be fooled. Elijah would take this drug when Blackwood came for him, would appear to die, would be buried, and 3 days later Solomon would dig him up with an antidote to reverse the drug's effects, bringing him back from apparent death. "Why 3 days?" Elijah asked. Solomon smiled grimly. "Because that's how long the drug lasts. Any sooner and you wake up in the coffin. Any later and the drug becomes permanent. 3 days exactly, that's the window." Elijah understood the risks. The timing had to be perfect. If Solomon was delayed, if something went wrong, if the drug was too strong or the antidote too weak, Elijah would die for real, would be buried alive and wake in the coffin, or never wake at all. But what choice did he have? Blackwood was going to kill him anyway. This plan at least offered a chance, a slim chance, but a chance. Solomon prepared the drug, a powder made from roots he wouldn't name, mixed with other substances. Prayers spoken over it in languages Elijah didn't recognize. "Hide this in your cheek," Solomon instructed. "When Blackwood comes for you, when you know death is imminent, bite down on it. Let it dissolve under your tongue. Your heart will slow. Your breathing will stop. You'll feel yourself slipping away. Don't fight it. Let it take you. Trust that I'll bring you back." He also gave Elijah a small knife. "If the drug fails, if you need to fight, this is your last option." Elijah's moment came on March 12, 1862. Blackwood called him to the study, said he needed help moving something heavy and important, and asked if Elijah would come with him that night. Of course Elijah would. He had no choice. He hid the powder packet in his cheek, concealed the knife in his boot, and prepared himself mentally for what was coming. That night, he and Blackwood rode out to the hidden cabin. Blackwood said the gold needed to be moved again. Union forces were getting too close, and they needed to relocate it to an even safer location. They began loading gold bars into a wagon. It was exhausting work. Each bar weighed 30 pounds. After an hour, both men were sweating despite the cool March night. Blackwood offered Elijah water from a canteen. Elijah drank. The water tasted normal, but within 5 minutes Elijah felt dizzy. His vision blurred, his legs weakened. Poison. The same poison Blackwood had used on the Confederate soldiers. Elijah's limbs grew heavy. He tried to reach for the knife in his boot, but his fingers wouldn't work. He collapsed. Blackwood stood over him. "I'm sorry, Elijah, truly. You're a smart boy, but you know too much. Can't risk it. You understand." As darkness closed in, as his body shut down from the poison, Elijah managed one final act. He bit down on the powder packet, felt it break, felt the bitter taste spread through his mouth. The drug mixed with the poison in his system. His heart, already slowing from the poison, slowed further, then stopped. Blackwood checked his pulse at the neck and wrist, found nothing. Dead. Good. Blackwood dragged Elijah's body into the woods 50 yards from the cabin, left it there, and returned to finish moving the gold alone. The body was discovered the next morning by field slaves walking to their work. They recognized Elijah immediately and ran to report it. The overseer on duty, a new man named William French, who hadn't been involved in the murders, came to investigate. He found Elijah cold and stiff, no pulse, no breath, no response, definitely dead. He reported to Blackwood. Blackwood came to examine the body, putting on a show of shock and distress. He claimed Elijah must have tried to steal from him, must have followed him to the hidden cabin. There had been a confrontation. Blackwood had been forced to defend himself. It was self-defense, justified, legal. No one questioned it. A slave attempting theft from his master, that was expected. A master killing a thieving slave, that was his right. The other slaves looked at Elijah's body and stayed silent. They knew protesting would only get them killed. Knew the system protected masters, not slaves. Knew justice didn't exist for people like them, but they mourned silently. Elijah had been kind, intelligent, one of the few house slaves who didn't look down on field workers. His death was a loss to the community. They prepared his body according to slave traditions, washed him, wrapped him in clean cloth, said prayers over him in the slave quarters where masters never came. Here is where Blackwood made his critical miscalculation. Perhaps feeling guilt, perhaps wanting to maintain appearances, perhaps simply wanting to ensure Elijah was actually buried and gone, Blackwood did something unusual. He paid for a proper coffin, a wooden coffin with brass handles. He also paid for a plot in Riverside Cemetery, the segregated cemetery where slaves and free blacks were buried. And most unusually, he attended the funeral. The funeral was held on March 13, 1862 at midday. About 40 slaves attended, everyone Blackwood could spare from fieldwork. A preacher, an old slave named Tobias, who conducted services for the black community, spoke over Elijah's body, quoting scripture about deliverance, justice, and God's ultimate judgment. The slaves sang spirituals that spoke in coded language about freedom, escape, and the eventual fall of oppression. Blackwood stood at the back, uncomfortable, watching to make sure proper procedures were followed. The coffin was lowered into the grave. Workers began shoveling dirt. Blackwood watched until the grave was completely filled, until the mound of earth was complete and shaped, until the marker was placed. Only then did he leave, satisfied that his problem was solved. His last witness was dead and buried. His secret was secure, the gold was hidden. His fortune was guaranteed regardless of how the war ended. If the Confederacy won, he could return the gold and claim a reward. If the Union won, he could keep it and use it to rebuild. Either way, he was positioned perfectly, but Blackwood was wrong. Elijah wasn't dead. The drug had worked exactly as Solomon promised. It had slowed Elijah's heart to 1 beat every 2 minutes, reduced his breathing to 1 shallow breath every 5 minutes, imperceptible to casual observation, convincing enough to fool everyone who'd examined him. But Elijah was aware, trapped in his body, conscious but unable to move or communicate. He felt himself being wrapped, felt the coffin lid closing, felt the descent into the grave, felt the terrible sound of dirt hitting wood, felt the weight of earth piling on top of him, felt absolute darkness, absolute silence, absolute isolation. The drug kept him in a state between life and death, not quite conscious, not quite unconscious. Time lost meaning. He floated in darkness. Sometimes he thought he was already dead. Sometimes he thought this was hell. Sometimes he thought the drug had failed, and he would be trapped like this forever. But through it all, one thought remained: trust Solomon. Solomon will come. 3 days, just 3 days, above ground. Those 3 days passed slowly for Solomon. He was taking an enormous risk. If caught digging up a grave, he could be executed. Grave robbing was a serious crime, even for a slave grave. But Solomon had prepared carefully. He'd gathered 4 other slaves he trusted absolutely, men who'd lost family to Blackwood's cruelty, men who had their own reasons to want revenge, men who would risk death for a chance at justice. Marcus, whose wife had been sold away, Isaiah, whose son had been beaten to death by an overseer, Joshua, who'd been separated from his parents as a child, and Caleb, who'd watched his sister be raped by Blackwood's guests. On the night of March 16, 3 days after the burial, these 5 men met at Riverside Cemetery. They'd brought shovels, lanterns, and the antidote Solomon had prepared. The cemetery was unguarded. No one expected grave robbers. They found Elijah's plot easily. The fresh mound of earth was obvious. They began digging, working as quietly as possible. Every shovel of dirt felt deafening in the night silence. Every sound seemed loud enough to wake the entire county. But no one came, no one heard. They dug for 2 hours. Finally, they hit wood, the coffin. They cleared dirt from the top and pried open the lid with crowbars. Lantern light illuminated Elijah's face, pale, sunken, gray, looking truly dead. Marcus touched his neck, feeling for a pulse. For long seconds he found nothing. "We're too late," he whispered. "He's gone." But Solomon pushed his hand aside, felt more carefully, and found it. Faint, impossibly faint, but present. 1 beat every 2 minutes. "He's alive, barely. Help me get him out." They lifted Elijah's body from the coffin. Dead weight, no muscle tone, no response, and laid him on the ground beside the grave. Solomon had brought 3 different antidotes in separate vials, the first to stimulate the heart, the second to restart breathing, the third to wake consciousness. He administered them in sequence, pouring them into Elijah's mouth, massaging his throat to make him swallow. Then he waited. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, 5 minutes, 10. "Maybe we were too late," Isaiah said. "Maybe the drug killed him after all." Then Elijah gasped, a huge, desperate, rattling intake of breath. His eyes flew open, unseeing, panicked. His body convulsed violently. The men held him down as his system fought its way back to life. His heart raced, making up for 3 days of near stillness. His lungs heaved, pulling in oxygen. His muscles spasmed. He vomited black bile, gagged, coughed, shook like he was freezing despite the warm Mississippi night. After 10 minutes, he could focus his eyes, could see the faces around him, could recognize Solomon. Did it work? Elijah's voice was a rasp, barely audible. Solomon smiled. "You're alive. That's what matters." Elijah tried to sit up and failed. His body wasn't ready. 3 days without movement, without food or water, without blood properly circulating. He was extraordinarily weak. "Blackwood," he managed. "Blackwood thinks you're dead and buried." Marcus told him. "The whole plantation thinks so. You're free of him now. We can get you north, get you to Union lines, get you away from here." But Elijah shook his head weakly. "Not yet, not done. Blackwood has to pay, has to answer for what he did." The men looked at each other. They'd expected Elijah to want escape, safety, but revenge. That was different, that was dangerous, Elijah. Solomon said carefully, "You're too weak. You can barely move, and even when you recover, what can you do? Blackwood has guards, guns, power. You're one man." Elijah managed a terrible smile. "I died, I was buried, I came back. You think Blackwood's guards scare me after that?" He gripped Solomon's arm. Help me get strong, help me get ready, then I'll do what needs doing." The other men were silent, weighing options and risks. Finally, Marcus spoke. "My wife died because of men like Blackwood, died in childbirth because he wouldn't pay for a doctor. If you're going after him, I'll help." Isaiah nodded. "My son deserves justice. I'll help too." One by one they agreed. This wasn't just about Elijah. This was about every slave who'd suffered, every family that had been destroyed, every life stolen by the plantation system. They filled in the grave, made it look undisturbed, and carried Elijah deep into the swamp to a hidden camp where escaped slaves lived. A maroon community that had existed for decades. Maybe 30 people lived there, families who'd run away, individuals who'd chosen freedom in the swamp over slavery on plantations. They survived by hunting, fishing, and occasionally raiding plantations for supplies. They welcomed Elijah, made space for him, shared food and medicine. Over the next week, Elijah recovered slowly. His body had been through trauma, the poison, the drug, 3 days of near death. He was emaciated and weak, but he was young and strong. With food and rest, he regained strength. More importantly, he planned his revenge, planned how to expose Blackwood, planned how to take the gold, planned how to use that gold to help his people. This wasn't just about killing Blackwood. This was about destroying everything he represented, about proving that the powerful could be brought down, about showing that slaves weren't powerless victims but people who could fight back. The first target was Cyrus Webb, chief overseer, the man who'd helped poison the Confederate soldiers, helped dump bodies in the swamp, participated in every cruelty for 20 years. Webb lived in a small house on the plantation's edge, alone because his wife had left him years ago, unable to tolerate his cruelty. On the night of March 23, Webb came home from his rounds, drunk as usual, unlocked his door and lit a lamp. He never saw Elijah waiting in the shadows, never had a chance to scream before a rope was around his neck. Elijah pulled tighter, held it, watched Webb's face turn purple, watched his eyes bulge, watched life leave. When Webb was dead, Elijah positioned the body in a chair, left the lamp burning, and carved 3 words into the table: "The dead rise." Webb's body was discovered at dawn when workers came for assignments. Panic spread immediately. How had someone gotten into a locked house? How had they killed a strong man without any sign of struggle? And what did that message mean? Blackwood was informed, came to investigate personally, saw the body, saw the message, and felt fear for the first time in years, because he recognized the implication. But it was impossible. Elijah was dead, buried, gone. This had to be someone else, some other disgruntled slave seeking revenge. Nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the gold or the murders, just coincidence had to be, but it wasn't coincidence. Over the next 3 weeks, Blackwood's men kept dying. Thomas Riddle was found in his bed with his throat cut, message carved into the headboard: "The dead rise." James Cutter was beaten to death with a shovel in the barn where he worked. Marcus Finch drowned in a water trough despite being an excellent swimmer. Samuel Cross was pushed from a barn loft, neck broken. Daniel Marsh was poisoned with the same substance Blackwood had used on the soldiers. William French, the overseer who hadn't been involved in the original murders but had taken over Webb's position, was shot through a window while eating dinner. Josiah Grant, one of the 2 men who'd fled earlier, was tracked down 20 miles away and found dead in a barn with the message carved into the wall beside him. Peter Stillwell, the other fugitive, was killed in a rooming house in Jackson. Each death was different. Each showed planning and patience. Each carried that same message: the dead rise. Blackwood hired bounty hunters, professional slave catchers who specialized in tracking and killing. He offered huge rewards, promising $1,000 for whoever found the killer. The bounty hunters searched and found nothing. 2 of them disappeared. Their bodies were discovered a week later in the swamp, partially eaten by alligators, with the message carved into nearby trees. The remaining bounty hunters quit. They said the plantation was cursed, said there was something unnatural happening, said no amount of money was worth this. Blackwood's workforce collapsed. Slaves refused to work, refused to stay in their quarters at night. They started building barricades and carrying improvised weapons. Those who could fled to other plantations or into the swamp. Those who couldn't flee huddled together and waited in terror, not knowing who would die next. The white community of Yazoo County was equally terrified. News spread of the killings, the mysterious message, the apparent inability to catch whoever was responsible. Some whispered about voodoo, African magic, slaves calling up spirits to take revenge. Others insisted there had to be a rational explanation. A gang of runaway slaves working together, possibly supported by Union agents, may be part of a broader plot to destabilize Mississippi's plantation system. Confederate authorities sent investigators. They found nothing useful, too many suspects, too little evidence, too much chaos. By mid-April, 11 of Blackwood's men were dead. The plantation had effectively ceased operations. Fields lay unplanted. Buildings fell into disrepair. Blackwood himself was a prisoner in his own house, barricaded in his study, sleeping in short bursts with loaded guns on his desk. His health collapsed. He lost 40 pounds. His hair went completely white. His hands trembled constantly. His eyes were sunken and haunted. He knew, deep down, he knew it was Elijah. Somehow, impossibly, Elijah had survived, had come back, was hunting him systematically. But Blackwood couldn't admit this, couldn't acknowledge he'd failed to kill a slave, couldn't confess to the murders that would explain why Elijah wanted revenge. So he suffered in silence, waiting for the death he knew was coming. Then on April 20, 1862, salvation arrived. Or so Blackwood thought. A unit of Union cavalry rode into Yazoo County, advance scouts for the forces that would eventually besiege Vicksburg. They were gathering intelligence about Confederate positions and supplies, looking for anything useful to the Union war effort, looking for loyal Unionists and slaves who could provide information. Their commander was Captain William Terrell, a career officer from Pennsylvania, tough and pragmatic. Elijah saw opportunity. He emerged from hiding, approached the Union camp at night, and told Captain Terrell he had information about Confederate gold, about murders, about crimes that needed answering for. Terrell was skeptical. He'd heard 100 wild stories since entering Mississippi. Slaves often exaggerated or invented information, hoping to gain favor or protection. But Elijah was specific. He gave details, locations, names. Terrell decided to investigate. The next day, April 21, Terrell and 20 soldiers rode to Blackwood Manor and demanded to search the property. Blackwood, desperate and terrified, initially refused, claiming this was Confederate territory and Union forces had no authority. But Terrell was in no mood for debate. "I have 20 armed men. That's all the authority I need. Now you can cooperate and make this easy, or you can resist and make this hard. Your choice." Blackwood chose cooperation. He sent word to the few guards he had left to hide the gold, to move it quickly before the Yankees found it. But Elijah was guiding the Union soldiers, leading them directly to the hidden cabin, to the cellar beneath. They arrived before Blackwood's men could move anything. They found the gold, all 20 crates. And they also found the 3 bodies Blackwood had kept as insurance. Captain Brennan and 2 privates, still in Confederate uniforms, still arranged in their staged scene, identifiable despite decomposition. Terrell examined everything, the Confederate Army stamps on the crates, the gold bars, the bodies. He understood immediately what had happened. This wasn't just theft, this was murder of Confederate soldiers. Theft of Confederate treasury funds, even by Confederate law, these were capital crimes. Even in the chaos of war, this was inexcusable. Terrell arrested Blackwood on the spot. He also arrested the 3 remaining guards who'd been trying to move the gold. All were taken to the Union camp under heavy guard. Word of the gold discovery spread rapidly. Within days, federal authorities from Jackson arrived. A judge-advocate came to determine proper legal proceedings. Technically, Blackwood should be tried by Confederate courts since these were Confederate soldiers and Confederate property. But the Confederacy didn't control this territory anymore. Union forces occupied Yazoo County, and Union military law applied. The decision was made. Blackwood would be tried by a Union military tribunal, charged with murder of 7 Confederate soldiers and theft of Confederate government property. If convicted, he would hang. The trial was held on May 10, 1862, in a commandeered courthouse in Yazoo City. The proceedings were swift but thorough. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the gold, the bodies, testimony from Elijah about what he'd witnessed, testimony from other slaves about the accidents that had killed witnesses, testimony about Blackwood's behavior and statements. The defense attorney, a Confederate sympathizer forced to represent Blackwood, could offer no effective counterargument. The facts were irrefutable. The verdict came on May 12, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. Blackwood and his 3 guards would be executed together. The execution date was set for May 15, 1862, 3 days away. Blackwood spent those final days in a cell, writing letters to his wife who'd fled to relatives in Alabama when the Union arrived, writing justifications, claiming he'd acted to save Confederate resources from Union seizure, claiming the soldiers had been deserters who threatened him, claiming everything was a misunderstanding. But no one believed him, no one cared. His time had run out. On the morning of May 15, 1862, 4 gallows were constructed in the public square of Yazoo City. A crowd gathered: Union soldiers, freed slaves, local citizens. Everyone wanted to see the execution of Harrison Blackwood, the man who'd been so powerful, so feared, so certain of his superiority, now reduced to a condemned criminal in a Union noose. The 4 men were led out, hands bound, faces pale. Blackwood's guards broke down, wept, begged for mercy. Blackwood remained stoic, silent, perhaps in shock, perhaps simply accepting the inevitable. The nooses were placed. The sentence was read. Captain Terrell asked if any of the condemned had final words. The 3 guards said nothing, but Blackwood spoke. His voice was steady, clear. "I regret nothing. I acted to preserve Southern wealth from Northern aggression. I would do it again. The Confederacy will prevail. You Yankees will hang for your crimes against our nation." Brave words, defiant words, but hollow, because everyone knew the Confederacy was losing. Everyone knew Blackwood had died not for the Southern cause, but for personal greed. The trap doors opened, the 4 men dropped. 3 died instantly, clean breaks, quick deaths. But Blackwood's rope was slightly too long. He didn't die immediately. He strangled slowly, kicked and twisted for almost 2 minutes. Some said it was incompetence, poor measurement of the rope length. Others said it was deliberate, that the Union hangman wanted Blackwood to suffer, that a quick death was too merciful for a man who'd murdered 7 soldiers and countless slaves. Either way, Blackwood died hard. His body was left hanging for an hour as a warning, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave in the Confederate section of Riverside Cemetery. Buried without ceremony, without marker, just a hole in the ground for a man the Confederacy wanted to forget. But there was one final piece of unfinished business. One of Blackwood's accomplices had escaped, a man named Josiah Grant, who'd fled before the Union arrived, who'd made it to Confederate lines, who was hiding in Vicksburg thinking he was safe. Elijah tracked him there. He entered the city disguised as a slave belonging to Confederate officers. He found Grant in a boarding house, drunk and scared and talking too much about gold and murders. Elijah waited until Grant was alone, until night had fallen and the city was quiet. Then he entered Grant's room. Grant never had time to scream, never had time to understand what was happening, just felt hands around his throat, felt the life being choked out of him. His last vision was Elijah's face, the face of a dead man, the face of vengeance. When Grant was dead, Elijah carved the message one final time into the wall beside the bed, "The dead rise." Then he left, walked out of Vicksburg, returned to Union lines, 13 men dead, Blackwood and all his accomplices. The account balanced, justice served. The Confederate gold was seized by federal authorities and legally became property of the United States government. $2 million was a significant windfall, could fund operations, pay soldiers, buy supplies. But Captain Terrell made an unusual recommendation. He suggested the gold be used for reconstruction efforts in Yazoo County, specifically to help the freed slave population, to build schools and churches, provide capital for businesses, fund the transition from slavery to freedom. His argument was persuasive. The gold had been stolen from Confederates by Confederates, had been protected by a slave who'd risked everything. Using it to help freed people seemed appropriate, just right. The Treasury Department in Washington considered the request, debated, and finally agreed. Within a year, 3 schools for freed people had been established in Yazoo County. A church was built. A bank was chartered that would provide loans to black farmers and businessmen. Processing facilities were constructed that let farmers sell crops directly to markets instead of through plantation owners. The gold that Blackwood had stolen and killed for became the foundation of a new economic system, one that gave former slaves real opportunity, real hope, real freedom beyond just legal emancipation. Elijah became a prominent figure in the freed community. He used his experience and intelligence to help others navigate the complex new world. He testified at multiple trials of Confederate officials accused of crimes against slaves. His testimony helped convict dozens of men who'd thought they'd never face justice. He helped establish some of the schools funded by the Confederate gold. He taught reading and writing to adults who'd been denied education under slavery. He became a minister, a community leader, a symbol of resistance and survival. In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was abolished throughout the nation, Elijah was 22 years old. He'd lived through the worst of slavery, had witnessed and experienced horrors, had died and been reborn, had taken terrible revenge. But he'd also helped build something new, had helped transform his community, had used his pain and anger constructively. Over the following decades, he continued this work. He married, had 5 children, lived to see them grow up free, lived to see his grandchildren attend universities, lived to see possibilities he'd never imagined as a slave. Elijah died in 1910 at age 67. By then he was a respected elder, a man whose story was told and retold, the slave who came back from the dead, the man who brought down Colonel Blackwood, the hero who turned stolen gold into schools and churches. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, black and white people whose lives he'd touched, people who owed their education, their businesses, their opportunities to the work he'd done. They buried him in Riverside Cemetery, not far from where he'd been buried the first time. But this time, there was no secret resurrection planned. This time, he rested peacefully, his work completed, his account settled. The legend that grew up around Elijah focused on the supernatural aspects, the death and resurrection, the ghostly revenge, the message, the dead rise, that terrorized Blackwood's men. These stories spread throughout the South, were told by freed people to their children and grandchildren, became part of the folklore of resistance, part of the mythology of liberation. Some versions said Elijah was 7 feet tall, that he could appear and disappear like smoke, that bullets passed through him without harm, that he was immortal. Exaggerations, but exaggerations based on truth, based on the reality that Elijah had done something extraordinary, had challenged and defeated one of the most powerful men in Mississippi, had survived when everyone thought him dead, had brought justice when the legal system offered none. The white community of Yazoo County tried to suppress and distort the story. After Reconstruction ended and former Confederates regained political control, they rewrote local history. They claimed Blackwood had been murdered by Union forces, claimed the gold story was Yankee propaganda, claimed the slave killings had been exaggerated or invented, claimed Blackwood had been a patriot and martyr. These lies were taught in schools, printed in newspapers, carved into monuments. Within a generation, most white families in Yazoo County believed the false narrative, believed their ancestors had been victims rather than perpetrators. The usual lies that communities tell themselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. But in the black community, the real story remained, passed down carefully, preserved as testimony. My great-grandfather knew people who'd been slaves on plantations near Blackwood Manor, who'd witnessed the panic as Blackwood's men kept dying, who'd celebrated when Union forces arrived and arrested him who'd watched the hanging and felt that justice, delayed and imperfect but real, had finally come. That testimony was passed down through generations, kept alive, preserved. A reminder that resistance was possible, that oppression could be fought, that even the most powerless could find power if they were brave enough and strategic enough. Today, if you visit Yazoo County, Mississippi, you won't find much physical evidence of these events. Blackwood Manor burned in 1863 when Confederate forces retreated ahead of Union occupation. The land was subdivided after the war, sold off piece by piece, eventually becoming farmland and later residential developments. The hunting cabin where the gold was hidden has long since rotted away. No traces remain, but Riverside Cemetery still exists. Elijah's original grave is there, the one he was buried in the first time, empty now, but marked with a simple stone placed by his descendants in 1925. It gives his name, dates, and a single line: "He rose that others might rise." A subtle reference to the resurrection story, a reminder of what he accomplished. Occasionally, visitors leave tokens at the grave: coins, flowers, small written prayers, acknowledgments of a man who refused to accept injustice even after death. Local historians have complicated relationships with this story. Some embrace it as important heritage, document it carefully, include it in historical tours. Others dismiss it as exaggerated legend, pointing out that details can't all be verified, noting inconsistencies in various tellings, suggesting the whole thing might be fabricated or dramatically enhanced for political purposes during Reconstruction, and they're not entirely wrong. The story has certainly grown in the telling. Details have been added, supernatural elements have been emphasized. Some aspects are probably more legend than fact. But the core remains documented. Union military records confirm the gold seizure at Blackwood Manor on April 21, 1862. Confirm the discovery of 3 bodies identified as Confederate soldiers. Confirm Blackwood's arrest and trial. Confirm his execution on May 15, 1862. Confirm testimony from a slave named Elijah about murders and theft. Confederate records, such as survived the war, confirm that a shipment of Treasury gold went missing in early 1862. Confirm that Captain Wesley Brennan and 6 soldiers were reported as deserters, later corrected to murdered when their bodies were found. The documentary evidence supports the basic narrative, even if specific details remain disputed. What do you think of Elijah's story? Do you believe he actually died and was resurrected by African medicine? Or was it an elaborate ruse that grew into legend? Do you think his campaign of revenge was justified? 13 men dead by his hand or at his direction. Does that make him a hero, or a murderer, or something more complex? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if your family has similar stories passed down through generations, stories of resistance, of survival, of justice claimed rather than granted. These histories matter. They need to be remembered, need to be told, need to be preserved so future generations understand that freedom has always been fought for, has always required courage and sacrifice, has always demanded that someone stand up and say enough, that someone refused to accept oppression even when the cost is death. Elijah did that. He literally died and came back to finish what he started. Whether you interpret that literally or metaphorically, the message remains the same: the powerful are not invincible. The system is not eternal. Resistance is possible. Justice, however delayed, can come. If you enjoyed this deep dive into dark history, subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories about resistance, survival, and the fight for freedom. Share this with someone who appreciates history that doesn't sanitize the past, that acknowledges complexity and moral ambiguity, that tells difficult truths even when they're uncomfortable. Until next time, remember, the dead don't always stay buried. The past doesn't stay past. The stories we try to silence have a way of rising, of demanding to be heard. of reminding us that justice delayed might be justice denied, but sometimes it's just justice waiting for the right moment. Until next video.